Okay, I think we've got all the bugs worked out to get started anyways. So we'll call the meeting to order. Have an agenda in front of you. Is there anything anybody would like to add into the agenda today? If not, we'll entertain a motion to accept the agenda.
I can give you that, Merrill.
Okay, Murray
Right.
gives us all in favor.
In favor. In favor.
In favor.
Favor.
In favor, carried. Minutes of March 11th meeting. Any corrections or amendments to the minutes?
Can make the motion to approve the minute.
Okay, Jen gives a motion. All in favor?
In favor.
In favor. In favor. In favor. In favor.
Carried. All right. We'll get right into the Recreation Master Plan implementation memo, and I'm not sure if Arliss is going to start or if Brian Badura is going to start.
Yep, so I can start from an introductory perspective here. What we have, I guess, from big picture on the agenda this morning, with regard to recreation funding policy and draft policy, is some actual draft policies drafted kind of using the baseline feedback that we had received from the survey feedback that council had filled out. But I do want to be clear that it's still a draft and it's easily changeable to council's desire, how they wish to see it. And this is by no means ready, I guess from an administration's perspective, it's by no means ready to be going to council in a week or anything like that. We're still sincerely trying to obtain feedback and direction from council as to what they'd like to see. So that's kind of the position that we feel we're in terms of where we're at with these policies. And really we're open to we really want to have a fair amount of discussion so we can kind of track, again, additional feedback from council and then work to incorporate that into policy that council might like to see and ultimately adopt. So you will have seen this memo before you, I guess, in a few different forms. Much of the information in here came at our initial policy committee meeting where we reviewed the master plan, rec master plan. So there is some redundancy there, but we thought perhaps the first exercise we could go through would be reviewing the survey feedback results that we got from council, and we can discuss those as we go through them. And for that, I'll pass the torch to Brian Badura to lead us through, if you don't mind, Brian.
No, sure. Thank you very much, Arliss, for the introduction into the recreation grant policy drafts that we have prepared. And first off, I just want to thank council for participating in the policy development survey. From an administrative perspective, it was actually a huge resource and I think a great process to go through to gather everyone's feedback. By no means is it 100% on every item, but a lot of the general consensus is overwhelming the same on what's wanted in these policies and so forth. So it seemed like it worked very well. And if I start rambling and whatnot, feel free to interrupt and ask questions or just stop me and if I'm off on a tangent or something like that. But like Arliss said, we keep going back to the Recreation Master Plan that was prepared by Har Group Management Consultants, and the objectives and strategies that they included in the plan in summary, is facilitating local and regional recreation services, addressing regional issues for services, supporting growth and change within the community, enhancing capacity building within communities, formalizing recreation funding criteria and processes, and planning for potential changes in financial situation. And I think having any policies, or I guess written policies before these policies really sort of bring together a lot of these objectives and strategies that were recommended in the Recreation Master Plan. So, if we can touch on the survey and go through the survey here and try not to spend too much time on it. So the first question, did the MD of Taber develop formal recreation grant policies to guide the distribution of funds? And overwhelmingly, yes, there is a want to have written policies to, I guess, guide recreation grants go forward. I think everyone's read the comments. I don't know if I need to read out the comments again or anything like that, but everyone can see that there is a want to develop recreation grant policies.
I think if council wants to specify, if there's anything in the comments that council wants to specify or make sure that we further discuss, then we can kind of go that route. Otherwise, we could focus on the primary results. Brian?
So unless there's any questions or any want to discuss any of the comments under question number 1, we can move to question number 2. Okay, and question number 2, should the MD of Taber provide recreation grant funding to? And there's various different items where we're asking who we should be providing recreation grant funding to. The first one is recreation boards and is 100% yes. Urban municipalities such as Barnwell, Taber, Vauxhall, 83 or 5 out of 6 said yes. Community organizations that operate facilities that are owned by the MD of Taber, located in the MD of Taber, 100% said yes. Community organizations that operate facilities that are not owned by the MD of Taber, located in urban municipalities or non-MD owned land. There was only 2 out of 6 that said yes, we should be providing grant funding for those organizations. So 1 said no, and 3 were unsure. Provide grant funding for community organizations that do not operate facilities and only provide programs. Again, 2 said yes, and 4 were unsure. And provide grant funding for community festivals or events. 5 out of 6 said yes, and 1 was unsure.
Brian, just for my curiosity, and I probably already know the answer, but can you tell us, community organizations do not operate facilities, programs only, who might those be? And the what question above that one, community organizations operate facilities that are not owned by the MD. Just an example or 2 of each one of those. Can you do that?
Okay, I'm just going to bring up, I think it's included on the agenda, the list of groups that we provide grant funding to, recreation grant funding to. So we provide sort of
go ahead.
funding. So we give the recreation grants that are sort of set like on the screen on an annual basis, as well as other grants. The majority of the other grants would fall into that category, where a lot of them are just not operating facilities, but putting on programs. And and a lot of them may not be within the MD of Taber. So on screen, there's examples of the various groups that would receive funding. So without naming names, like I say, the vast majority of them would not likely own facilities, but just put on some sort of program.
My comment would be that we've used this as a catch-all. Like when I look at Lethbridge Chamber of Commerce 100-mile luncheon opportunity, I'd be hard-pressed to say that's recreation. It falls under economic development. This just happens to be where we've done a catch-all.
I guess my question would be, Brian, as a rough percentage, how many percent of our grant funding, recreation grant funding, would be in this category?
So as you can see from the totals at the very bottom, for recreation grants, as far as community groups and rec boards and other municipalities, we give just over $5 million a year. For the other grants is approximately $25,000 a year is what we budget. I'm trying to figure out my head if, as a percentage-wise, is that 5% roughly?
Thanks.
With regard to the spreadsheet before us now, that's slightly over 500,000, I believe. I believe the million was a million word was mentioned, so it's 500,000. Oh, slightly over 500,000.
Did I say $1 million?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I meant $500,000 or $500,000.
There we go. Yeah. What question were you on, Brian?
So I was on question 2, and if we count the unsures under the yes or possibly category, then essentially all those types of fundings is something the survey shows we would want to continue with. And if we're ready to move on to question 3. Question 3, essentially, please provide additional comments in relation to organizations that should be funded. And under there was more of just a way to verbalize any additional comments. Okay, if there's no more comments on question 3. On question 4, should the MDA Chamber have separate policies for how funds are distributed to recreation boards, urban municipalities, and community organizations? And we had 5 saying yes and 1 unsure. So when we finish going through the survey, we have developed 3 separate policies on how to outline procedures for recreation grant funding, which is, as I was indicated in this question. Question 5, should an annual limit be established for recreation grant funding? Example, once the limit is reached, no additional funding is provided. And we've got 5 yeses, 1 no, and 1 unsure.
That'll be 4 yeses.
Or sorry, 4 yeses. And if I'm taking too much time, I can move a little quicker through them and not wait so long for any questions or comments. Question 6, if you select yes in question 2 in support of the funding Recreation Board, should Recreation Board be allowed to use the funding provided? Should Recreation Boards be allowed to use the funding provided to them? And here's examples of the choices were to pay for specific kinds of expenses. Example, cost to operate MD-owned facilities within their hamlets or areas. The other choice was to spend at their discretion, including distribute to other community organizations that operate facilities that are not MD-owned or provide programs in their hamlets. And there was 0 for that. So in other words, there wasn't a want to give money to another organization so they can give it to somebody else, I guess. Unsure, 0, and then please provide comments. So it seems like the consensus was to earmark these funds to pay specific types of expenses. Question 7, if you selected yes in question 2 in support of community funding organizations, do you think community organizations that do not operate MD facilities should be eligible for operating capital or both types of grant funding from the MDA-Tabor? Operating only, 3, capital only, 0, both operating and capital, 2, and unsure, 1. So I guess not really consensus, but it looks like if funds are given to community organization, it would be for operating as well as capital.
Brian, is that the way it kind of works? Like with the Grassy Lake or the Enchant or the Hayes rec boards, we give them the money, they get to do with it what they want? Or is it specified now what they can use it for?
Actually, what we do is when we send our letters requesting what they spend these recreation grant funds on, we indicate that it's both for operating and capital.
I can speak to what happens in Hayes specifically. So the way all of the groups work it is anybody that has a facility, insurance and utility costs come off of the grant money, or we have to in that way. And then there is a little bit of money left in the account, but they've decided that it's going to stay there and not be divvied out because they anticipate increased utilities. So that may go over what the grant comes in at. And then Marie might be able to comment on how Enchant does it, but that's how the Hayes Rec does it. And then I don't know if Brian can tell us how Grassy handles it as well.
Yeah, Enchant is similar to just what Jen said. We get applications in and ask for their financial statements and pay the utilities, and then we do keep a little bit of money in the kitty in case somebody has a wreck, like a hot water tank or furnace go out, and that's more or less how we do it this way.
Yeah, Grassy's a little bit different. They basically only have one association, and they look after everything.
Did that clarify your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rec boards probably have a better handle on what they need and how to divvy up the funds. Probably better than we do. And I guess, I mean, I just wanted to know how it was actually done right now versus what we might be proposing. But Yeah, I think that answered my question.
Carry on, Brian. Yep.
To carry on, question 8, if you selected yes in question 2 in support of funding community organizations, and these are community organizations that do not operate MD-owned facilities, could they apply for capital grant funding? Should it be available for buildings only or for buildings, equipment, and other capital expenses? And this question is in the event that these community groups that have their own facilities, not on MD land or owned by the MD of Taber, provide grants for buildings only. 2 indicated to provide for building only, and 2 said provide for buildings, equipment, and other capital expenses, and 1 was unsure. And question 9, we can move on to question 9. If you selected yes in question 2 in support of funding community organizations, should a limit be identified on how much community organizations can apply for recreation grant funding? And for yes, there was 4 said yes, and 2 were unsure. And this was specifically to set limits on how much community groups could apply for funding. Question 10 relates to question 2 again. If you selected yes in question 2 in support of funding community organizations for funds that are distributed to community organizations, would it be better if the rec boards decided on behalf of the MD of Taber how grant funds were distributed? A committee group was established for the MD as a whole to review and evaluate applications and make recommendations for council about the distribution of funds. Another approach, or unsure. Now, these were sort of unclear on which the preferred route would be, so.
Again, I know that probably the rec boards and the communities know better than what the needs are in the community. However, I think the Vauxhall Rec Board was disbanded because council was taking care of all those, or making those decisions. And I could be wrong, but Jennifer Levitt Murray could expand on that. But at the end of the day, depending on if we're just going to give a lump sum to the rec boards, that they could probably make the decisions better on who needs it and who doesn't. But if we were to form like a committee of council, are we prepared to do the work to make those decisions? Are we going to take the time to go inspect facilities and all that to see the needs, or going to let the recreation people in the communities do that?
This is Tamara. I see us as a funding model for those of you from the hamlets who already sit on it on your own community contribution. I did wonder, should that be a part of the MD, since we have, not because we want to oversee the money, but so we have a direct relationship with those rec boards, because maybe the next councillor, you know, in 20 years' time doesn't have the same relationship that you have with them. And then are we prepared with the community of Barnwell, Vauxhall, and Taber to compile the grants that we've been distributing just as a lump sum? Because those are the areas we seem to have split off.
I'm sorry, it was a little bit choppy on my end. What was the last part, Tam, about the municipalities?
So I just wanted to make Yeah, it is kind of choppy in here too, maybe. Wanted to understand if we're prepared to claw back those grants that we've been giving, like to the Barnwell Senior Center or the Vauxhall different baseball, or are we going to give just a one lump sum rec to the municipalities?
Anybody else have any?
And maybe I could,
Go ahead.
oh, so maybe I can add something. In the draft policies, we haven't set it out perfectly where funds will be given directly to, let's say, the town of Taber, the town of Vauxhall, or the village of Barnwell. There is a possibility to form new recreation boards or recreation groups to do the oversight of how that money is distributed, that is allocated for each area or each community. So that could be a possibility to have new rec boards established and be the oversight if that's something that council wants to pass off to other boards.
That would be in a scenario if that's what council wanted to see, right, Brian? So right now you have, does Barnwell have a recreation board? I don't think they do they?
Not
But
that I'm aware of.
The Tabor Recreation Board is kind of rooted out of the municipality, the town of Tabor. And then the other recreation boards are based out of our hamlets. I guess the makeup and purpose of those boards, when you compare it with the town of Tabor, is different, right? That being said, you give lump sums of money to both. So there's some similarity there. You do have representation on the town of Tabor board.
Yes.
I'm not sure what authorities they give that board, or if it's primarily advisory in nature, advisory to council.
Yeah, you would say that's just an advisory board that. Yeah, like the community, well, everything always goes back to council for their final approval though.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the community waivers and whatnot, community recreation facility waivers that they provide, those all come to the rec board, and the rec board kind of makes a recommendation to council. At the end of the day, council decides if the recommendations that they got from the rec board are going to be upheld. But the rec board does have some authority, if you want to call it that. They go through all the community grants and waivers applications, and they have a certain amount of money that they can use for waivers and whatnot. And they kind of decide, but then it does go to council.
And then currently your hamlet recreation boards, they receive the lump sum funding, and then they administer those funds within their area district. Correct?
That's the way I understand it. Go ahead.
And my other question on those hamlet recreation boards, then how much is our our ag services and our community, our hamlet foreman people assisting those groups? Like, I just don't know. And that was one of my comments is I don't really know how we're running all that recreation. I've read it, but is it just the lump sum, or are we providing additional assets to them so that their parking lot can be graveled, or if something breaks, our guys are able to go in and help? And then my sort of $1 million question, because we're going to spend a lot of time on recreation, is do we as a council feel this is an area we're spending too much money? Or is this a savings opportunity, or are we going to make a percentage of our budget recreation and then we'll divide it up? Because the nickel and diming of $1,000 or $10,000 to a group, to me, is very challenging. It's what's our role as an MD with recreation? And I think that's where we struggle, and we always come back to is who and why and what should we be funding. But if we had a budget amount for recreation, maybe we operate within the confines of it.
So operationally, we do have Jason Bullock on the line. He could probably speak to kind of the operational relationship that currently exists and has existed in the recent past. Jason, do you mind piping in?
Yeah, I can try and answer that question the best I can. A lot of these rec boards, as you know, are older, and their limit to doing physical work is fairly minimal. And so a lot of it then relies on us to take care of their needs, whether it's outside or inside. And as an ag service board, we provide a lot of that physical labor. So whether it's mowing their ball diamonds, or whether it's helping with sprinklers or whatever we have going, excuse me, the Ag Service Board does that along with a lot of our summer staff, so that we bring in.
Jason, is that quantified somewhere in a budget other than your ag service budget? Like, do you have line items that we spent 100 hours mowing lawns for Hayes Rec Board, that where it's actually quantified the amount of money or dollars that are being spent doing those things, or is that just all quantified in your ag service budget?
Mr. Badura and I this winter, as we sat down and after this recreation master plan came out and we started looking at stuff, and we've moved all of our summer staff that used to be under Ag Service Board. We've moved them into the Parks and Recreation budget lines. We've moved a few other things over so that they can be found and followed. But there's a lot of stuff that, as an Ag Service Board, we do Parks and Rec that never ever shows up. Examples, simple, easy examples are Jordan's going down to do tree spraying by Grassy Lake, and I'll say to him, "Oh, we got a sprinkler that's not working in the park. Would you stop and have a look at that sprinkler and fix it?" And so he'll spend an hour there after he's done tree spraying. Things like that never get accounted for in line items. It's really tough to start to separate that kind of stuff.
So,
You know,
go ahead.
Murray here. Jason, like in the Enchant Park, I know we do our own mowing. I think the MD comes up and does some spraying for us, but then we do get some gravel from time to time that's in by letter to council there, but we do pretty much all the mowing and stuff ourselves at our Enchant Park. Jason,
Yeah.
it looks after the stuff in the town, in the hamlet of Enchant. Thank you.
Correct. And that Murray threw out a good one. We come in and spray their park. That one doesn't show up anywhere. So that's just part of a chemical budget and our time that goes into the municipality or with our hamlets and parks and recreation area.
So that, does that address the initial question, Councillor Mianega?
Yes, it seems we're very intertwined, and I'm not opposed to that. I think it's just important to recognize it. And I worry that if we say we have to quantify it, we may spend more time quantifying than we do doing the work.
Yep. Yep. Quantifying every little thing could prove to be a bit of an unnecessary challenge, but for all intents and purposes, and Jason Bullock can correct me, but it appears that recreation and parks is integrated into the Department of Ag Services, right? So from an operational perspective.
It certainly is. And Parks and Rec, I've visited with our Reeve a few times about this the last year and a half, but our Parks and Recreation areas in the municipality are getting used more and more. Our residents are asking for more, and if you go back 10 or 12 years ago, ball diamonds were never used, and they're pretty busy now. So a lot of our parks are well used. So recreation is a busy place, and, our residents are asking for more.
And if I can just add, so to identify specifically and for what let's say Ag Service Board or Public Works provides for recreation, cross departmental how do you say that cooperation between the different departments is sort of the norm for the MD of Tabor. So, you know, like Service Board would also be spraying the landfills and transfer stations. You would have, let's see, Public Works providing mechanical services for fire departments, Ag Service Board, and recreation. You'd have the IT department doing IT for every department across the municipality. So if we do look at maybe these specific services and getting the budgets correct, it might be better to just budget in a different way. For example, like Jason mentioned, we transfer all the wages for all the STEP students. So 10 or 12 STEP students from Ag Service is now being accounted for and expensed in the Recreation Department.
Brian, Badura, just one question. Is there, I know with the Hayes Rec Board, they do pay back for part of the students. Is there any other groups that do that?
No, it's what we've done is that one student for Hayes is specifically, I guess, for Hayes for a couple months. None of the other hamlets have STEP students that are specifically assigned to that one community. Maybe Jason can explain it. I think the STEP students travel in pairs or groups and go out to different areas and work. It could be anywhere, any day of the week.
Okay.
So Brian's comments, I just, previous to what he just said, I think speak to the reality of the complexity of trying to track those costs. He used a good example with the IT department. The IT department provides services that support recreation, but they're not really captured in that context, right? So does finance, right? They provide services that support the recreation that's being delivered, but it's not really captured in the cost of recreation. So given we're an organization of the size we are, it's probably a pretty complex task to get really accurate on. And then you do have to ask the question if it's worth our time to go through that exercise.
So on this, there's two that we're saying there should be a committee or a group established. Two are unsure, one another approach, or the recreation boards decide on behalf of the MD how the grant funding should be distributed. Where does everybody want to go with that? Is it, like I said, there's two that are thinking a committee or a group should be formed to review and evaluate applications. What's everybody thinking? What are they on this particular topic?
I don't want to interject, Reeve Harris, but with regard to that question, but when we get into the meat and potatoes of the actual draft policies, that question will become very natural as well. Yeah. There's a policy that I believe deals directly with this aspect. So
Carry on, Brian.
Okay, moving on to question 11. Question 11, again, if you selected yes in question 2 in support of funding community organizations, which of the following issues or criteria should be considered to evaluate applications for recreation grant funding from community organizations? So it says select up to 5. So the alternatives there, I believe everyone selected up to 5. So some show that none were selective, but I don't think it means they're exclusive of what should be in a policy. But in general, the top responses, what should be included is funds are needed. So if they're achieving a financial surplus beyond what is requested, grant funding may no longer be provided. Must demonstrate use, participation, attendance, and benefit to the MDA-Tabor residents without the need for membership exclusive access. The services must be provided within the MDA-Tabor boundaries, are generating other funds, not just relying on grant funding, provide accountability of funds, provide past use of funds, quotes, receipts, demonstrate use of volunteers to provide services. The service must be held for the benefit of the general public, to the general public. So those were the top responses of criteria, I guess, when establishing a policy. But the ones with zero responses to them, I don't believe that would specifically exclude anyone, and I don't think that's the way the draft policies are used. So question 13, if you selected yes in question 2 in support of funding community organizations, if new recreation grant policies are developed for community organizations, should they apply only to new applications for funding? For example, a grandfathering clause for organizations that already receive funding, or to all organizations, including those already receiving funds, and some may no longer get funding? And the answers there overwhelmingly, again, these policies should apply to all organizations, including those already receiving funding. So the indication of question 12 was there wasn't a want to grandfather in existing funding. And question 14 at the end of the survey is, please provide any further comments or suggestions about formalizing grant funding policies for the MDA-Tabor. And there again, rather than me reading them out, if anyone wants to elaborate or ask questions on the responses.
I think we can, Brian, I think we could move right into the review of the first draft policy here, the Land Trust Reserve Fund policy. And we can, again, wanting to emphasize to council that we're very eager to have hear discussion and receive feedback so that we can integrate it accordingly into these draft policies. Do you want to provide, Brian, a little bit of background as to where the concept comes from? This concept comes from, as well as perhaps some similar use in other municipalities.
Sure. So this first policy or draft policy of the Land Trust Reserve Fund, what this refers to is the monies that are set aside according to the Municipal Government Act, Section 671(2). Whenever there's a subdivision in the MDA-Tabor, either the developer has to put in a certain dollar amount for these purposes, recreation purposes, or provide a land. In most instances, a dollar amount is provided for when a subdivision happens. Now, even though we may not have had a written policy for the use of Land Trust Reserve Fund, we particularly have been following what's said in this policy. The funds are put in a separate account. interest is accrued and goes back into that trust account. And the funds are used specifically for, and have been in the past, used for the purposes of a publicly owned park, a publicly owned operated recreation area, school board purposes, or to separate areas of land that are used for different purposes. So we've essentially just put it down in black and white in a policy of what we've been doing in the past and how this particular reserve fund is being used.
Now, Arlos and Brian, we have a fund of that nature set up already for when subdivisions are made, correct? The what you pay.
We do have an existing fund. Yes, correct, Brian?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so every month that on the reconciliation, our general account is listed there, as well as this particular land trust reserve or public reserve trust account is, I believe, how we look at them.
John here. So currently we don't have a policy, and this policy reflects common, I guess, operating procedures we've already been following. Is that right?
Yes, this is the way those funds have been distributed in the past.
So, excuse me, so basically just formalizing a policy around the use of that money.
Yes, that's correct.
Anybody have any questions or concerns with this proposed policy?
To provide a little
there was
more.
only one item.
Go ahead, Brian.
There was only one item, a sentence. Actually, we're looking at it at the top of the screen. The section that says municipal reserve. No, it was right up on the screen, our list, if you scroll up a little bit.
Right there.
Where it says municipal reserve funds must only be used for municipal projects on public lands or publicly owned operated facilities. It's just moving some words around where the publicly owned operated facilities come before on public lands, so that it's clear that any funding is for facilities must be on public owned lands as well. Other municipalities have ran into the issue where there could be publicly owned operated facilities on private land, and it's causing a little bit of issues in other municipalities. So I've made that note on a policy to move those words to indicate that the facilities must be on publicly owned land.
And to provide a little more context with regard to this particular type of policy, it's actually something that we discovered as part of our, I guess, scan when we scanned other municipalities and what policies they were using. This is one that we saw there was a gap currently, so felt it was relevant to be suggesting and putting in front of council.
Not that this is too pertinent to the discussion, but Brian, what, and I'm sure I should know this, but I don't. How much is in the reserve trust right now? We're above the minimum 50,000 that you're proposing maintaining in that account.
Yeah. So there's just about there's right around $140,000 currently in that account.
Okay.
Does council have any other thoughts, discussion, or questions on this particular topic? if we don't know the answers to the question, we'll definitely mark them down and then bring them back for further discussion as well. Okay. We can move on to the next one, which is entitled Operational Grant for Recreation Boards, Towns, and Villages. So this is where some of that discussion that we reviewed in the survey results will likely be a little bit more unpacked in terms of how council wants to see the governance aspect of administering recreation funds. Brian?
Okay, and yes, just to reiterate what Arliss mentioned. So this is a really draft form. We put it together just to make sure this is the direction council wants to take in providing recreation grant funding to the community rec boards and or the other towns and villages in the MD Tabor, and more or less based on a point system. So based on the facilities that are being operated or the services, recreation services being provided in those communities. And also with recognition in Section 2 with ensuring that our hamlet rec boards, which are solely operated by community volunteers, ensuring they have enough funds to continue to facilitate operating more or less municipally owned recreation services. So none of this is how do I put it? It's only an example or a recommended example if this is the process or the type of policy that we're going to put in place to split up the rec grant money to the different communities.
So Section 4 refers to the point system, correct, Brian?
That's correct.
Split on 2 pages. So the concept here, from what we've seen from other municipalities, as well as what was kind of alluded to in our recreation master plan, that's the other guiding document kind of in the background, is that the MD establishes an envelope of money that they want to contribute to recreation. They develop or they run through the exercise of this point system, and then they take the, I guess, proportions of that point system and apply it to the envelope of money that they've budgeted to be distributed amongst the hamlet recreation boards as well as the urban municipalities that they would consider donating, providing contribution to. So this is a pretty integral piece in terms of recreation funding, and this is where we want to get feedback and discussion from council to see if that's something that they would be open to considering. We purposefully didn't put in live scenarios because I guess there would be a time and place for that, and probably as part of the first run of our policies, probably would not be the first time and place for that. I think you guys would want a little more lead time to look through and see what live scenarios would look like, given a general point system. But that's something that's probably an additional information item we can bring back in the future, so you can see what that might look like with perhaps, say, our existing levels of funding and how it would break down to recreation boards and municipal contributions. But yes, we are looking for feedback and direction and discussion here for sure.
I guess.
So Levitt,
Go ahead,
I was
Levitt.
just going to say in regards to the point system, I guess I'm not totally opposed to that. It makes sense on the way to distribute the funds according to each program or service that each rec board has. But I know, say in there it says the Vauxhall Rec Board. Well, Vauxhall doesn't have a recreation board, so how would that work? And then me knowing too, like, if we do divvy it up on the point system, I would like to know that that money is actually then going towards that recreation in that community, not funding something, a different recreation in that community as well.
So what exactly is your question, Levitt?
So one being like Vauxhall doesn't have a recreation board, so that we would have to probably talk to our counterparts there to see if they'd be interested in reestablishing the recreation board. And then two, the point system, like, yes, guaranteeing, I guess, if we are giving up money based on a point system, it would be good to know that that money that is being distributed proper ways to that recreation. For instance, if the community halls or whatnot, they are supposed to be getting that rec board is getting X amount of dollars based off of this point system, but they're not divvying up that money to that certain hall or whatever it might be. Like, I would like to make sure that point systems actually get distributed out accordingly again.
Yeah, so if that's a concern of council as a whole, then you would probably, from a governance perspective, I mean, you pointed out one way that you could go about that, working with your municipal partner in the town. However, if the MD so desired, they could establish their own Vauxhall Recreation Board and fund it accordingly, and then have them distribute those funds. If you're worried about the, I guess, end distribution. However, that would definitely change a dynamic that's currently in place.
It would be, this is Tamara, it would be tough for us to be dictated by another municipality how we should spend our money. Of course, we aren't really in receipt of any money from anyone. So to me, when I saw this point system, I thought it would just clarify how we give out the certain percentage of money. That was my thought, is if we had a budgeted amount and then we had a rationale, because it sounds like that might have been some of the origin, but it might have been lost over time. And it would also take us out of figuring out, is it the curling club? Is it the golf course? Is it the gymnastics? Because I do see, you're right, Levitt, it's a huge challenge, but I don't know how we're going to decide unless we're just going to be a funding body. And is that the business we are in a little bit already?
Well, I just, yeah, and I guess that too, because like, then just know what happened through the winter there. A lot of people are asking, well, how much money does the MD give Town of Vauxhall grant funding, right? And then, so now if they see that it's all based on point system, I think a lot of these groups will be expecting X amount of dollars, because the only reason they're getting that money is because they're operating, or they're the ones using that facility. So I think if the money goes to them, then that's great and fine, but sometimes, like, it'd just be nice if it would be fair that way, that the only reason they're getting some of this money is because of this point system. So in that case, those groups should be getting that money then.
John here, I think the same could be said then for the Hamlet Recreation Boards as well, because a lot of this funding that we're seeing here would also go to them. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure that works, to be able to tell, I guess, boards how to spend their money. It's one thing to have the funding, and it's another one to, I guess, unless you're going to be divvying it out yourself and be in control of all these funds of every organization or every place you're going to send your money, and having full control, I think it's very challenging to implement that.
If maybe I can get Arliss to scroll down to our recreation grant schedule that's attached. I believe we have seen these instances over the years where funds are given to a community and they seem to focus on their own facilities that they operate within their community, and maybe some of the other organizations that operate community facilities get excluded. And so you can see right below, it starts right around the agricultural type of activities of rodeos and 4-H's, where they appear, it doesn't go back far enough, but they appear sort of because the group getting the recreation grant was excluding them from receiving funds. And as you go below the rodeos and the 4-H, again, those groups appeared on the list because it was observed that they were being excluded from receiving funding out of our grant dollars that were given to that community. So that did exist. It was happening, and that's how it was addressed. The policy doesn't really address that again, and it could be a problem that comes up. I guess unless there's another, how do I put it, a section added to create a rec board that encompasses those types of recreation services, that the monies are allocated for another rec board, maybe an MD Ataba rec board, to look at these groups that seem to fall off once funds are given to another municipality.
I would
Well,
caution.
Vauxhall-
Oh, go ahead.
If Vauxhall had a rec board, maybe they should reinstate it, and then that might clear up some of the misconception of the money being distributed, maybe.
I can probably add to that to an extent. The rec board that Vauxhall had didn't have the role of having any financial responsibility or onus on making financial decisions. They were only a recommendation board to council for recreation. So there was no monetary or cash value to that board. So if that was the case, we would most definitely have to ask Vauxhall to include that in their bylaw they were going to do. But the way the rec board functioned was just an advisory capacity. And even when they did report how they were spending rec funds, it was from a spreadsheet and there wasn't really a lot of context. I mean, Levitt might be able to add a little bit more to that, but it definitely didn't paint a clear picture.
Just some general comments as it relates, I guess, to the end application or end use of these recreation dollars. I think it would be that, and I know we don't always operate in a perfect world, but ideally you'd like to be providing these recreation contributions in the context of partnership. So using that example, you're partnering with your hamlet recreation boards to provide that service in those hamlets. And I think with the other communities, i.e. village, town, and town, you would want to try to remain consistent in that approach of being a partner. So you would provide that municipal contribution similar to the way you provide it with your recreation boards, theoretically trusting that it'll be used to deliver the recreation services that are required in that area. That doesn't mean that I don't see or recognize Levitt's, the point that Councillor Haug made, but I think that's the approach that should be taken when we're looking at making these contributions. And I would caution about all the other organizations that seem to not fit in at some point, and this is just a comment from a spending perspective. At some point, you're going to have to just, as difficult as it is, you either make a policy stance and say, this is the amount of money we have to contribute to this. Sorry, we don't have any more. Or you make the money available. So it's it's a tough point to come to, because sometimes that means telling groups, and actually well-deserved groups sometimes, no, we don't have funding. But there could very well be that day in the near future where it's a reality, because our revenues are not growing like they were. They're reversing.
One question I have, Brian, and just trying to figure out how the point system might work. And I'm just going to maybe use Vauxhall as an example. So they've got the Lions Club or the Lions Campground out there north and east of Vauxhall just a little bit, and then the riding arena or the old Saddle Club, whatever you want to call it, out there east of Vauxhall. It's actually an MD facility, if I remember correctly. Do those sort of things work into the point system like those facilities, or they excluded, or how do facilities like that get accounted for in the point system?
So under number 3 on the policy, the grant funding requirement, the recreation boards must submit a facilities list, or if the grant's going to a town, the town must submit a facilities list and financial statement by March 31st. So in other words, they'd have to provide an inventory of recreation facilities that they would provide funding to. So if they're not providing any funding for that Lions Campground, they wouldn't be included on their inventory list. Same thing for the rodeo grounds. If they're not providing any funding or doing anything with that rodeo grounds outside of Vauxhall, they wouldn't be able to include it on their inventory list for the point system.
Okay, so then let's just go to 3B there. Each recreation board shall have complete discretion as to how they wish to distribute the funds allocated to them. Again, going back to the Town of Tabor Rec Board, they don't make those decisions. And I don't know that there's I don't think Barnwell has a rec board, so it would just be the village would get that money and decide how it's going to be distributed from there. And then with Barnwell, how does the grant money that we're giving to the seniors work into this scenario? Just so I understand.
Yeah. So, like I say, it's a draft. It's by no means at the point where we would recommend to take any of this to council. I guess the decision or the feedback we're looking for is, do we, I guess, with this policy, make it so that these boards would be established and have those sort of powers, or if we change the wording in the policy to just essentially include it to encompass the town of Vauxhall, town of Tabor, and village of Barnwell, that they would be the organization that would receive the grant funding rather than a recreation board. And then again, with the question with the village of Barnwell, again, the same. The wording would be if the village of Barnwell would be the group that the grant is given to, they'd provide a facility list. The seniors hall would be included in that facilities list as let's see here. Seniors hall would be given a point system 100. So just like in any other community, the seniors hall would be given a point of 100 in the funding list.
Okay. Tamara?
And then I think I would want to make sure that in the policy that we're not obligated to give that money if it's a percentage of our income earned, or, you know, if all of a sudden we can't pay our staff to gravel our roads, then we might have to be able to have the ability to not give it. But I think, to me, that's the big decision in the room is, are we prepared to give it to the municipalities and to our hamlet rec boards or not? I think it's, it's not whether we think curling or golf or shooting is good. It's, are we prepared to be partners with our other municipalities, and to what extent, and to have faith in them that they'll do the right thing.
And that's definitely a question that we're looking for clarity on, because this is the policy where we would, I guess, clarify that and make that clear as to what council's desire is.
You were talking earlier, we say we're gonna spend 600,000 or $1 million or whatever, and then we have to use this point system to allocate that. Let's go back to 2A. So are we saying everybody's gonna get $10,000 and then the point system gets some more? Is that what we're saying?
Yes, so that's the intention of section 2A is just to identify the hamlet rec boards in Enchant, Hayes, and Grassy Lake, that those are communities that the facilities are mostly, whether they're owned by the municipality or most of them are sitting on municipal-owned land, and they're wholly, I guess, they're operated by volunteers, and just to ensure that they have adequate funding to provide those recreation services, which is predominantly used by municipal residents. There could be the general public coming out to hamlets to use those recreation facilities, but predominantly they're used solely by municipal residents that live in the area.
Okay.
And that $10,000 number, it's just a number for now. Like I say, draft policy. It's there just to recognize that if that number has to be larger or smaller or whatever the number has to be, just the policy would reflect that there, regardless of what the point system comes out to, adequate funding will be provided to our hamlet rec boards.
Yeah, that would be the underlying principle, right, Brian?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, when you do the point system here, everybody's treated equal. Every community, depending on what they've got, is treated the same as any other community. So and that's been a question I think that we've all had over the years, is how did we come up with the numbers that we're giving them now? So at least this way, everybody is at least treated somewhat equally to start with.
It's an attempt at equity as well as recognition of services being provided, right? In a very from an objective perspective. Yeah.
I mean, I look at walking past and you get 100. It's one of the most well-used facilities in this community, whether it is in other communities, but that walking path is probably the busiest recreation facility in this community.
Yeah, and if I can add, the point system, I believe what the point system recognizes is some of the costs involved with providing those types of services. So even if a walking path is heavily used, the annual operating cost of taking care of a walking path is significantly lower than, let's say, an indoor swimming pool or an arena that requires essentially multiple staff in those facilities at all time when it's being used, and even when it's not being used, there's still staff there. And I think the point system tries to associate a cost with that particular facility. Some facilities just cost more to operate. They have year-round utilities that need to be paid and insurance and things like that, whereas when there is no physical structure, i.e. 4 walls and a roof, the costs are considerably lower.
Yep, agreed.
Merrill, just one comment. The only difference between a facility and a hamlet or a village or a town is they have another revenue source. A facility in one of our hamlets, we are 100% of their funding. They have no other revenue. So I think we probably have a greater responsibility for some of these hamlets than we do facilities in combined.
So I think that was attempted to be addressed, and I mean, as far as amounts and things like that are concerned, that can be changed as per council's wish. But with regard to section 2A, trying to ensure that the hamlets have adequate funding, I believe that was the purpose and primary purpose and reason for that clause. To Councillor Bruin's question, Brian, can you confirm? Can you confirm that?
Yeah, Arlos. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. I mean, we just have to recognize that our hamlets are paying 100% of this. That is their only funding source to continue operating.
Right.
Right.
And maybe,
So just-
go ahead.
So Brian, you're saying that the only funding source they have is us as an MD?
Correct.
Because the majority of the facilities in the hamlet of Hayes all have a board that's operated, and most of them have access to casinos. So I have to say we're not the only source. They do have other sources.
Certainly not in Grassy. They're 100% relying on the MD for their recreation funding. They don't have the ability to fundraise and do casinos and stuff. Quite honestly, they don't have the manpower or the number of people that would be required. I think if we pushed them into that, we would lose them, and we'd be looking after them all.
And sometimes the decision not to have casinos, it's because of religious or, I don't know. I sit on a board that doesn't have a casino, and I wish it did, but we have to be respectful of why casinos don't get applied for. So it's not that they're lazy, it's just, it's a different approach.
Speaking of casinos now too, I wonder with this COVID is what type of impact that's going to have on all these community organizations. There's a lot of them do casinos, and now with rules changing on if they can do them anymore, I think there's going to be a lot of organizations that will be short on funding in the next couple of years, I'm assuming. But that's another thing to look at on how that will all work. Because a lot are able to be sustainable by themselves because of the fundraising they do, whether it be casino or other means. So that's another one to look at too. That for funding in the future.
Yeah, it's certainly a complicated issue. We're not dealing with apples and apples. All our recreation boards, I think, are handled a little bit differently.
Yeah.
I think the biggest key from, I was just going to say the biggest key for me, I think, on these community-run organizations and the community halls and such. So I think the biggest in our hamlets is making sure the utilities and insurance is paid, and then from there, we have to fundraise and go together on the capital projects, like whether it be a new roof or something along those means. But I think that's I think something for sure in my eyes that we should make sure we cover are utilities and insurance to make sure it's protected that way.
I would agree with you, Levitt. I think we'd have to also make sure and add, though, to make sure the building is kept in shape too. If they have to do a roof or renovations or something, that there's funding available for that.
One as a point of notation, Brian Badura, could we include a clause? It was mentioned, I believe, by Councillor Minega, to the effect of, or at least for further consideration, to the effect of that the money that the MD makes available is a budgetary decision, and not necessarily guaranteed year after year. If I am understanding the previous comment correctly. And to circle back a little bit, it would be nice to get some clear perspective and discussion and direction around whether we want, what approach we want to take with regard to our, I guess, urban municipal neighbors in terms of whether we would be looking to them as from a partnership model, or would we be looking at establishing a separate recreation board to govern those funds. That would be worthwhile for us to know at this point, or get a feel for what council would like moving forward, so that we can work on the policy accordingly.
So, I'll go back to what I said before. I must have misread the policy, or misinterpreted, I guess. Because when it comes down to the only way they can get funding for certain ones is if they prove that they're funding them, and I think that's, I guess, enough for me to say that they can get the funding. It's through the grant or the application that they're showing that they are funding those certain groups. I feel that that's a fair enough way of doing it. I must have misinterpreted how I read it before, so sorry about that.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what you just talked about, what you're looking for there, Arliss?
Yeah, so perhaps just in the context of confirming with Levitt, based on what you just said, you said, or you're saying, from what I understand, that you'd be okay utilizing, in your scenario, the town of Vauxhall as the partnering organization to receive recreation funding. Is that correct?
Yeah, like ideally it would be nice if there was citizen input on where the rec funds are getting put, as there are in all the other communities. It would be nice to have the recreation board back, but at the same time, when the grant application's the same way throughout, in order to get certain funding, you have to show that you're also funding those to get the funding for it. That's, I guess you have to just trust the system that way and go that way with it.
Right, the fact that they have the particular facilities and those particular services, the point system, more or less justifies that the contribution goes there.
Yes, as Mr. Badura pointed out earlier, like with like the Lions Club and the rodeo grounds and such like that, if they didn't fund it, they can't apply for that grant. They can't apply for those points, essentially. It's only if they're funding a certain thing that they can get those points. And I must have misinterpreted that earlier in the policy.
Brian, do you want to maybe revisit the points perspective, the points approach? There may be a misunderstanding.
Yeah. So, and then what I was thinking, maybe the policy isn't complete. So there could potentially be facilities that, fall outside of the municipality, like Vauxhall or Tabor, or, possibly they're inside those municipalities, but they just don't provide any funding for them. Maybe what I was thinking is to be prudent to have just a municipal district of Tabor rec board. That would be the catch-all for, facilities that we currently fund, like the Tabor Exhibition Association. They would maybe considered a rodeo ground, and they would be marked under the MD of Tabor, as well as the Vauxhall Golf and Country Club. And those particular items would be included in the point system, but would not be included in the town of Tabor or the town of Vauxhall. They would be included in another rec board, let's say the MD of Tabor rec board, that those funds are allocated to that board to provide funding to those groups that would potentially fall off the table, that have come to the MD in the past and said, hey, we don't get any funding. You give a recreation grant. We have facilities, actual buildings that we got to pay insurance and utilities for, but we're not getting any funding. The funding's going to this town or that town, and we're not seeing any of it. So, is that something that we would maybe want to look at? Is an additional sort of board or whether it's even if it's just MD Council that has identified these particular facilities as eligible for grant funding, but they seem to fall by the wayside is how I put it. They're right next to an urban municipality, and they're providing services, recreation services. They don't seem to get grant funding that's intended for them.
That might actually fill in that gap, Brian.
Rather than another board, I'd be in favor of it either at MD Council or at Ag Service Board as a adjunct part of their group. That was the comment we heard time and again. We have too many isolated boards.
I think it's something that could be easily incorporated into MD Council for sure. If that's what council desires, yeah.
Yeah, I think that would work pretty good because it'd be just essentially working off the point system itself already. So it's not like really we should be allocating more funds or less foreign funds to them. It's just based off the point system already anyway.
What would be the pros and cons of having it a separate board with just MD representation on it? Arlos or Brian?
It seems to work good in the hamlets. I don't know, maybe a board member on one of the hamlet rec boards can say a pro and con of how it's done. It's just another group that it could be all members of council that allocate it.
I guess we'd have to identify how many outside entities that would include. It'd be, well, cumbersome's not the right word, but to get together to allocate money to 2 or 3 groups, that would take half an hour, you know. So I'm just, trying to keep it as simple as we can, whether it's at Ag Service or Council. Another board to allocate money to 1 or 2 entities seems a bit much.
This is actually probably an item we could take back because it was derived as a result of our discussion today, and we could take back and integrate a potential way it could look into this policy and go from there. I think we could take some time and go through the list and see which perhaps organizations or groups fall outside of what you typically get, and see what kind of an impact it would have in that regard, because we can't answer that right at this moment. So
It's certainly an item you could bring back to us in the future.
Yep.
Okay, any more discussion on this operational grant for recreation boards policy?
Yeah, I got one more, I guess, in regards to like eligibility on some of these groups on making sure we're not giving money to people that already have lots of money in the bank and that don't for sure need the funding, like, and that they're sustainable as is. Like if there's, we want to make sure we cover the utilities and fixed costs, whatever that might be, and then if it's over, like if we set a threshold for X amount of dollars over, then they're not eligible for any grant funding, like something along those lines to make sure that the funding is actually going to the ones that really need it or are unable to fundraise.
And maybe I can touch on that. In this particular policy, we haven't included anything with regards to that because we're relying on rec boards to do that portion of it. Ensure within their jurisdiction that they're not continuing to fund a particular facility just to bank money, and another facility is not getting funds they require. have included something to that effect in the next policy that is coming up, that we ensure that they don't have a bank full of money and are actually providing some sort of recreation service. This particular policy relies on the towns and villages as well as the rec boards, that as long as there's a facility there and it's being operated, that it gets funding through this point system.
Okay. So then how would that go towards, like, you know, for doing in-kind work for groups too? Should there be like I personally think there should be a stipulation in there too, if they have over X amount of dollars or they make X amount of money, that they can pay someone around this area to do the work for them rather than having us do this for free for them.
And again, the in-kind work is discussed in the next policy that we have a draft of. So what I'm trying to say is not the norm to provide in-kind work for the town of Taber or in-kind work for the town of Vauxhall. There may be some of that in the community rec boards in the communities, but that's the responsibility of the municipality to look after some of the facilities that are in our hamlets. We own them; they're on the land that we own. And, likely, if the sidewalk needs to be repaired, we'll just fix the sidewalk, or if the parking lot needs gravel, we'll put gravel in the parking lot.
Brian, anywhere in these policies, do we have anything when another entity would come to us looking to build a new facility, for example, an indoor multi-use soccer facility, for example, on how we would look at those kind of requests?
So that would be the first policy we looked at, the land trust reserve, which specifically was managing those funds that are put away to improve, make capital improvements to projects. And what that policy excludes is any operating expenditures.
Okay. Well, like the amount that's in the land trust right now would prohibit us from contributing too much, and without borrowing, I imagine, or something like that. If a new facility, if the MD agreed to participate in a new facility.
Yeah, and that's correct. I guess even if there isn't enough money in the municipal reserve fund for that, there's other reserves or other ways to fund capital expenditures. But I think what it does is it separates the funding for operations from the funding for capital. So the $500,000 or the 500, just over $500,000 that's earmarked for, you know, operating as well as capital expenditures for providing recreation services. That's not the grant fund that would be used for larger requests for capital expenditures, a new multi-use facility or a dry sports field. Those items would come to council possibly through the land trust reserve as and an independent request that could possibly be funded out of funds.
Okay, thanks.
Does council feel comfortable moving on to the next policy, which is the draft tape donations policy? Or is there other points on the operational grant for recreation boards policy that you'd like to further discuss? I do believe we've got some good feedback to take back and work into and integrate into the policy for further consideration. But I do want to make sure we get as many folks' perspective as we can. Okay, moving on to the third and last policy for discussion with regard to recreation today. Brian, you wanna?
And again, for sure. Sorry to interrupt you, Arliss.
No, go ahead.
So taking into account the survey of council for developing recreation grant policies, this is a third policy to more or less address requested funding for recreation programs or other programs where there may not be an actual facility that the group owns, and again, provide a limit on the amount of dollars on an annual basis to address in-kind donations or things like that to community groups. And this would more fall under the list of other grants that we provide. And on an annual basis, we budget for about $5,000 for those grants. However, that dollar amount is annually up to at council's discretion of how much grant funding to provide. This particular policy, it has a little different look in it. I found that just on a side note, having columns listing like in our point system policy, in the policy we just discussed, I couldn't get things to line up properly. So that's why this one looks a little different. It's easier to format, and I didn't spend a lot of time formatting it. I could spend more time on the words in the policy. So this particular policy establishes a funding allotment on an annual basis, describes criteria as identified in the survey of under, I guess, on the next page under number 3, the criteria is there's an evidence for the need, the number of local residents served, the quality of management, the past track record of the group applying for grants, number of volunteers, identifying possible barriers for services by minority groups, level of involvement with other community partners, and an agreement that the municipality will be acknowledged of their contribution to their event. The limit is approximately the $25,000 that we budget on an annual basis for these types of grants. There is a limit per organization of $2,500 that they can apply for, as well as a $1,000 limit for in-kind donations. There is a grant application attached that would have to be filled out and provide information on what the grant will be used for. And one of the final things is the stipulation that the CAO can provide donations of $200 or less, would have the authority to just provide those donations. Otherwise, just like it has been in the past, all applications would continue to come to council for approval. So again, this policy is quite similar to the grant receiving. If we look on the grant list, applied. I guess just formalizing it in a written policy and a grant application process.
And Brian, this does deal with requests for services in kind as well?
That's correct, yes.
So, Brian or Arliss, number 4, A1. So is this meaning I came up with about $25,000? Is that the maximum amount of money that would be allocated under this policy? Is that what that is, like 333 per capita? I just use 7,800. That's roughly 25,000.
So we'll have Brian expand on this, but earlier in the policy, does mention some criteria, and one of those criterias are number of people served, yes, number of local residents served, right? So if there's a group that wants to be providing a service or asking for a donation to provide a service or a program, I believe you would take the number of people that that are being served as a result of that and apply that per capita amount.
Okay.
Although there is a maximum established of $2,500.
About 2,500.
Yeah.
Okay.
Brian, is that consistent with the underlying principles?
Yeah, so that's what the principle is, and if we look at the lists of current grant recipients, like even the recreation grant, there's a few groups that don't have their own facility that are getting a recreation grant. There's potential that they could apply under this particular grant in the event that they don't qualify for the recreation grant under the previous policy. And if we do scroll down to the other grant list, we have been including a large sum of money for, it's not really recreation, it's for the Southern Alberta Air Rescue. And without the funding included in that list, there's potential that the amount we've been budgeting, $25,000, could be more than enough that's required for giving this type of grant to community organizations. And what this does is it more or less sets a maximum allotment limit and spreads around money to community groups that potentially could use the help.
See, I see some of the groups that we currently have on our list being able to access this, so I think that would max out at 25 quite quickly, unless we're maintaining the list that we already had and not encompassing some of them into here, like some of those ones that are 1,500 or 2,500.
Do you want to scroll, Arliss, can you scroll to the other grant list? I think we've included it just below recreation grants, other grants. So this is the other grant list. And particularly, like I mentioned, the annual donation to the Southern Alberta Medicare, which, I'm not certain that would be a recreation grant, would fall under this policy. It might just be another type of contribution that the municipality gives. If you notice, we haven't included any funds for the Chamber of Commerce's. We normally give the Taber and District Chamber of Commerce about $20,000 a year, which I believe funds the Corn Fest, and I think we gave $6,000 for the Vauxhall Chamber of Commerce. So those would be outside funds outside of these policies, and potentially the Southern Alberta Medicare Society would be outside of these policies with their funding. And if we apply the limits to the groups that are included in here, potentially a $25,000 a year pool of funds for other organizations might be sufficient. The majority of those contributions are under $2,500 if we look in the past of where we've contributed funds.
So where would the mowing of like the cemeteries and things like of that nature, of that type of in-kind, would that fit into this here too then, or is that fits in under something else and that's part of Ag Service Board and not really much under this recreation right now?
I didn't intend to include mowing of community inside the hamlets or cemeteries as part of this request. They wouldn't likely have to make a request to do that under these policies.
Okay.
Those really are being taken care of by existing operations. Those really are being taken care of by existing operations. That being said, I definitely understand where the question's coming from because administration, I believe, over the last year and a half or so, has been working to, I guess, put that more front and center for council's information to see where and when those in-kind services are being provided. But that being said, and this was actually touched on at the last council meeting. Lots of that stuff is kind of part of typical operations and has I don't want to say always, but has traditionally been done that way. So specifically to, I guess, grass cutting, weed spraying, those types of exercises, those have typically been absorbed into our regular operations. And Jason Bullock can confirm or explain otherwise, but that's my understanding.
Yes, Sarlis, you're on the right track. A lot of that goes to what I mentioned here half an hour ago. Our Parks and Recreation Department is growing, is getting bigger, and it is taking more time to keep them up. But it is something that we've done for years, whether it's at a shooting range or we've even helped the Vauxhall Golf Course over the years with grass seeding and things of that nature. But most of the stuff that we do are annually, every year, whether it's mowing, spraying, whatever it might be. We've even been having a huge problem the last I'll even push back 3 years with gopher control in cemeteries and in a lot of our park areas. We have been trying to manage gophers, and we seem to be losing, but that's just something we've taken on. So,
Tamara.
And so we do recognize that the Ag Services has been doing this, and that's why I brought up that comment at the last council meeting, when we're getting these requests, when those were things you've already done. So I wonder, part of it is just clarification for council and for myself to understand all the work that's been done, but maybe we're opening up a Pandora's box that doesn't need to be opened. If it's part of operation and you have the resources that you need. The reason I felt I wanted to unpack it and understand is because when we had other municipalities saying, you guys aren't doing enough for us, I wanted to be able to say, well, actually, this is what we do recreationally. And that was sort of why I pushed it. But I do worry if we make you, count your 5 minutes at the killing a gopher and 20 minutes spraying, that'll take away from the amount of work that you're already doing. And so then my question is, do we just need to change our resources and have an allocation and an understanding of the in-kind work so we have something to say to the other municipalities? Sorry, that's always long for me.
I think there is some merit to having a policy such as this in place because there are scenarios where in-kind requests come that are what I would say rather unique, perhaps. So in other words, not on an annual basis or not part of regular operations. There are requests that come that are once in a while. Do you know what I mean? I can't think of an example right off the bat, but they might be event related, right? Specific event related, or could be a one-off scenario of a group that's pursuing a certain initiative. But I think there's a place for it. However, your comments do beg the question in terms of maybe better defining what is what, so that we know what's an application and what's part of regular operations, right? So that's something that we can take back and work on a little bit more too.
It might also be helpful if we had a list of these, not that we need to check and balance it, just so we have an understanding as council on what things are done on an annual basis, because there could come a point in time where it's an overwhelming list. If we continue to add to this list, more staff might have to be added to maintain a lot of the things we've been doing every year, and to have more clarity, I guess, and it's maybe just have an ongoing list, and not necessarily for approval or rejection, but just to have that list so that we have an understanding of what we're doing. And then, and maybe being able to, that would also assist in when other municipalities are saying, you know, you're not contributing enough to recreation, we can then ballpark or give an estimate of what we're currently doing, even if it is just an ongoing list, and keeping track of it, and not necessarily down to the minute, but just an idea of what we're doing. That might be helpful to council.
And I think that's something we can endeavor to provide, with the qualifier that it may not be perfectly accurate, or it might, like you said, Councillor Turcato, it might be more of giving us an idea as opposed to a surefire, quantifiable amount.
Okay, is there any other questions or comments on this policy in front of us, or anything that we've discussed so far this morning? And you feel you've got enough feedback from council to refine these policies a little farther?
I think we've received a fair amount of feedback that we can work to incorporate for council's future consideration. I will ask Brian Badura to see if there's anything he wanted to further clarify with council as it relates to this donations policy in particular, just because this was the last one, and we want to make sure that we understand what council's looking for, and council does indeed get that chance to tell us expressly what they'd like to see.
Yeah, and I don't have any further questions. I've made a bunch of notes and took down some information, so I think I got what I need.
Okay, that's everything on the recreation policy then? Want to take 10? Oh yeah. Okay, let's just take 10 minutes and have a break for 10 minutes. Yeah, I gotta walk from